We're going to begin in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 5, verse 9. We're going to look at another passage in Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. And we're going to see just this little glimpse of heaven tonight of what God allowed John. Of course, the revelation of Jesus Christ, the last book in the Bible, is written by God, amen? But John was a human instrument. And so God allowed John to get just a little peek into heaven so we can kind of see what heaven is going to be like come worship time in heaven, okay? And it's an incredible scene, but what we're going to do is after we look at this in a couple passages here in the book of Revelation, we're going to back up to Genesis 1:1, and I don't want to scare anybody here tonight, but we're going to take a very quick journey through some very familiar places in the Old Testament, and we're going to see how God has invited people all the way back from the creation of time, the beginning of time, all the way to right now in 2017 in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Fort Gibson, wherever you may be from. Listen, God is inviting us to join Him on this incredible, passionate journey to make His name known all over the planet, to every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. And we're going to look at some familiar places in the Bible. And we all know these stories that we're going to talk about tonight, but I'm telling you, in every one of those stories, there's this pinnacle verse. There's this one verse that jumps out that causes us to realize the big ticket reason why God allowed the David and Goliath to take place, why God allowed the Joshua to take place, why God allowed Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and all those stories to take place. And it wasn't about those great people. It was about God. And I want to submit right off the bat to you and me that our life, my life is not about me, and your life is not about you. But our lives are about God. And He's inviting us today, on this very day, to join Him on the most passionate, exciting journey to fulfill what's going to happen with you without you, with me without me. Well, we're getting ready to read, this is going to happen. Do you know why? Now, listen, I believe that Jesus died that none should perish, and I don't want anybody to misread what I'm saying. The reason why we know that what I'm getting ready to read is going to happen is because it's in the Bible. And the Bible is truth from cover to cover. So what we're getting ready to read about, this picture, this glimpse into heaven, this will take place even if we snooze until the day we die. So the thing we're going to talk about tonight, if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus Christ, guess what? If I do not embrace what we're talking about tonight, and we're going to pick up tomorrow night where we'll leave off tonight, it'll be kind of a two-part if you would, that if we do not embrace this as followers of Jesus Christ, guess what? We still go to heaven. Because this thing called grace, we ought to go to hell. I've done enough stuff this week, I ought to go to hell. But we go to heaven still because of this thing called grace, because Jesus came and died and you've embraced that. But if we don't embrace this, even though we still go to heaven, whenever we draw our last breath, we'll look back on our life and we will think of words like average, typical, we'll think of words like apathetic. But I'm telling you, if you and I as believers embrace what we're going to talk about tomorrow night, whenever we look back on life, taking that last breath, we'll think of words like passionate and radical and a life that really made a difference. And God's inviting us on this amazing journey. So let's take this glimpse into heaven. Revelation chapter 9, verse 9, or chapter 5, verse 9. And they sang a new song saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation." I want you to say with me, every tribe and tongue and people and nation. Let's do it again. Every tribe and tongue and people and nation. Now here's what God is saying through John to us today. He's saying that in the end of time, whenever we're all in heaven together, there's going to be at least one person represented from every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. That word nation, by the way, has nothing to do with geographical boundaries. Back whenever that was originally written, that talked about specific people groups around the world. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to go to heaven, but I'm saying this. Before the end of time, the gospel will be preached into every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. And at least one person from each one of those people groups will have embraced the gospel of Jesus Christ. And here's how we know that. Because the Bible says in the book of Revelation, that's what heaven will look like. So it will happen. If I get with it, guess what? I get to be a part of it. If I snooze for the next 5 years, 20 years, 30 years, however many years I have left on this planet, it's still going to happen. It'll happen with me, without me. It'll happen with you, without you, because it's in the Bible and the Bible's true. So every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation will be represented in heaven. Now let's look at it again, Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. "And after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, from all nations," say all nations, say tribes, say peoples, and tongues, standing before God or before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands and crying out with a loud voice saying, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. I'm just telling you, from every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation, people will be represented there because they will have come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ and will have embraced that. Now, these numbers, I'll just kind of round them off, and you can look on different websites and get different numbers, I'm sure, but there's approximately 11,200 people groups on planet Earth today. 11,200. Of those 11,200, about 6,000, a little over 6,000 of those are considered unreached. What we mean by unreached is less than 3% have actually come to Christ. And whenever we say come to Christ, we're talking about people who have not only come to Christ, but understand what that means, and they're reproducing for the gospel, for the kingdom. Less than 3%. So over 6,000 of the 11,200 or so people groups are still unreached. However, out of those 6,000 that are unreached, there's a little over 3,000. Last count I saw was 3,009 people groups who are not only unreached, but they're unengaged. That means as far as we know, there's not any believer that's working with that people group yet to see them come to Christ. Now, wouldn't it be amazing? And this is a great church that has a great heart for the nations. And I'll promise you, you're going to have the opportunity to be able to walk into an area of the world where there's an unengaged, unreached people group, and by the glory of God and by His grace and His grace alone, potentially see the first one of those people embrace Jesus. Can you imagine? You see, right now in 2017, there are heart languages that are not yet heard in heaven. They're not there yet. They haven't been reached yet. But can you imagine, for the glory of God, it's not about you, it's about God. If you ever think it's about you, it's over, because pride will kick in and it'll kick your tail every time, and mine as well. And it has before. And so I just want you to know, can you imagine adding, by the glory of God, to that list someone who is not yet heard in heaven, but they embrace Christ, and when they die, they go to heaven, because it will happen. Amen. It will happen with us, without us. Every tribe, say every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. Now, I want to back up into the Old Testament to Genesis 1:1, and we're just going to look at some verses real quick, and we're going to go on this quick journey to see how God is on this passionate hunt for every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation, okay? Genesis 1:1 simply says, you know it well, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 6 chapters and 6 verses later, which was a lot of time, but God so regretted even creating man because sin had just run rampant over the earth. So listen to what it says in Genesis 6:6. And the Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and He grieved in His heart. So you know what He did? In Genesis 6:8, He hits the refresh button, doesn't He? He finds this guy named Noah, and he says, I want you to build a boat. And I know you haven't heard of rain, but I'm telling you, this amazing thing is going to start falling from the sky, and there's going to be a flood, and the earth will be flooded 40 days and 40 nights. It's going to rain over 150 days. It'll be underwater, and you guys are going to sail around this boat. So we know the story about that well. Now, before I go on, there's something that I believe that is worth our time tonight in Genesis 6:8. Look what it says. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Say grace. Say grace. Here's what I mean by that. The Bible tells us that Noah was a good man, and it's clear about that. He was a good man. But do you know why Noah was used in such a powerful way? Because God's grace. I want you to understand, even a guy as great as Noah should have gone to hell. And the reason why I say that is I want every one of us in this room to understand we should go straight to hell when we die. And if it wasn't for the grace of God, we'd all be in hell. And Noah, even in that same boat, no pun intended, Noah, even in that same boat, the Bible says was a good man, but I'm telling you, he wasn't used of God because he was a good man. He was used of God because he found grace, the same grace that you and I found, and the same grace that everyone needs. Then we go on to Genesis 9:1. After the refresh button has been hit, we find out that 8 people get out of the boat. And with the 8 people after the flood is Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and his daughters-in-law, right? So 8 people, and here's the first commandment found in the Bible. Genesis 9:1 says, so God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's the first commandment you find in the Bible. You know, it's the only one we've ever fulfilled. No kidding, isn't that crazy? Be holy, walk away from sin, not so much, okay? Be fruitful and multiply. Done. We did that one, says the guy with 5 kids. So anyhow, we listen to God on that commandment, and then here's what happens. This is where this story kicks into high gear for me. In Genesis 12:3, listen to the promise that God gives to a man named Abraham. Everybody say Abraham. Say Abraham. I want you to say that one more time. Abraham. We're going to need that name later. Listen to what it says. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Again, say all the families. All the families. You know what all the families of the earth is? Every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. God gives this amazing promise to Abraham and says, son, listen to me. Through you, all the families, say all the families. All the families of the earth shall be blessed. And then God takes off on this sprint of making himself known to every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. And God chose to use ordinary people, just like he chooses to use ordinary people today to make his name renowned all over the planet. So I want to hit some familiar verses from the Old Testament, some familiar stories, and we're going to look at one pinnacle verse from every one of those stories. And the first one is the story of Moses. Now look, everything I'm getting ready to say tonight, I want you to understand, man, there are great biblical principles throughout the story of Moses. I mean, here he was, Pharaoh's daughter finds him and falls in love with him, and just everything that takes place, how he walks away from the riches of Egypt and counted it a greater privilege to have suffering with the people of God. I mean, the story of Moses is amazing. And you can find biblical principle after biblical principle after biblical principle in the story of Moses. And I'm saying this, continue to teach those, continue to preach those. By God's grace, may we continue to live those. But in the story of Moses, there's this one pinnacle verse, as there is in every story, that lets us know why God, first and foremost, did the whole thing with Moses. The big ticket reason why God allowed the story of Moses and the life of Moses to take place, even though there's a ton of great faith principles throughout it. But I want you to listen to what it says in Exodus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Now the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I, that's God speaking, I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine before him, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your son's signs the mighty things that I have done in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. You know why God did the whole Moses thing? Because he wanted people to know who he was. It wasn't about Moses, it was about God. And it's not about you, it's about God. It's not about me, it's about God. But God's going to get every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation done with us or without us. But here's what he's saying. I'm inviting you. I'm inviting you to join me with the most radical, passionate journey on planet Earth. You're welcome to come. And whenever you die on your deathbed and you're ready to step into glory forever, you'll look back and go passionate and radical in a life that was worth living. Not another decade going by going, what's the point to it all? I'm just war slick. Man, God's inviting us. Now we move to another familiar story, Joshua. I love the book of Joshua. 24 chapters of battles. Many, many things to learn there. A young man who has the baton passed from Moses right before his death. Moses is buried at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and we find that Joshua now is the leader of the children of Israel. Principle after principle after principle in that guy's life, all the way to where he's an old man saying, as for me and my house, we shall what? We're going to serve the Lord. He lived a great life. But I'm telling you, there's this great verse in chapter 4, verse 24, that I believe is the absolute big ticket reason why God allowed the whole life of Joshua to exist. Listen to what it says. It says that all the peoples of the earth may know. Say all the peoples. Say all the peoples. That all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. This is right after they crossed over River Jordan in flood stage, and God allows the river to raise up into a high heap up by the city of Adam, and the rest of it runs down, and they walk across on dry riverbed, and God told Moses, or told Joshua, have each one man from each of the 12 tribes pick up one stone and carry it out of the river, and you build a monument on that side of the river so you'll always remember, and your children and your children's children, when these little Hebrew boys and girls are playing out on that riverbank, they're going to come up to their grandpa one day and say, okay, I've got a question. We can throw any rock we want to into that river. We can play with any rock on this riverbank except for those 12. Every time we even get close to those 12, somebody says, no, not those. Leave those around. What's the big deal about those rocks? And that grandpa will be able to pull that little boy or that little girl up on his lap and say, let me tell you how and when God moved in your grandpa's life. It was to help them to remember. But I want you to listen again why God allowed that to happen. Joshua 4:24, that all the peoples of the earth may know, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. The reason why God allowed the life of Joshua to take place, again, many principles to teach, many principles to preach, many principles to live. But the big ticket reason was this, that his name, God's name, would be made famous to every people, all the people. You know why? Because he is on this passionate hunt for every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. And it's going to happen. And it wasn't about Joshua, it was about God. It wasn't about Moses, it was about God. It's not about you and it's not about me, it's about God. But God is saying, you are welcome to join. I want you in this race. And life can matter. We move on to the story of David. I love the story of David and Goliath. And in 1 Samuel, there's this incredible verse. And we know the story. And listen, here's this little guy, and he's watching his dad's sheep. And Jesse says, listen, I want you to run over to your 3 oldest brothers that's in the battle. And you got, the Philistines against the Israelites. And I want you to take, this stuff and give some stuff to the captains. And I want you to give some stuff to your sons. Bring me back a report. And he gets there, and there's this big standoff. There's no battle cry. There's no, sounds of battle going on. And David walks up, and here's the scene. You know it well. On one side, you've got the Israelite army. On the other side, you got the Philippine army, the Philistines. And you got down in the middle, you've got this giant of a guy, and he has ripped off about 25 heads of the first men that came after him. And no, that's not it. He hadn't touched so much as a hair on a chitty chin chin, but he shouted out with his big mouth, as Satan always does. And I'm not some kind of guy up here with my chest thrown out. I might have been shaking in my sandals with the best of them. I don't know. But little Davy went in and he took care of business because God plus none is a majority. And it's a great story. And there's all kinds of great principles for us to teach and preach and continue to try to live. But I want to tell you, he shows us the big reason why he allowed the David and Goliath experience to take place. And listen to what it says in 1 Samuel 17:46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know. Say all the earth. That all the earth may know that there is a God of Israel. It wasn't about David. I love that story. But the big reason why God did the whole thing was so people would know who David's God was. So all the people of the earth may know who my God is. Listen, I'm just saying, it wasn't about Moses, it was about God. It wasn't about Joshua, it was about God. It wasn't about David, it was about God. It's not about you and it's not about me, it's about God. And God, from the beginning of time, has been on this dead sprint to use people for His glory, to take His name where no one has yet heard. And that might be down your street. To take His name, to make Him famous to every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. Because guess what? It's going to happen. And at least one will receive. We can sleep through it and still go to heaven, or we can get radical about it and have a passionate life that is so worth living. That brings us to another familiar stop, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Man, again, one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Man, so many different principles learned. You know, one of the greatest things about that story, I remember how, here's these guys, these 3 men, and Nebuchadnezzar, this wicked king, makes this new decree, says, hey, every time music begins to play, it is forehead to the dirt. You've got to worship in front of this big image that looks like me. And so everybody is on their face before this big idol except for 3 guys. You don't think they stood out. And then all of a sudden, Nebuchadnezzar has them brought before him. And see, the crime was, or the punishment was going to be that they were going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And so you know the story well. And so he looks at him and he tries to give him one more shot. And he says, we're not going to bow, because the only one we're going to bow in front of is our God. And here's the coolest part to me in that story. It's so unique to hear those guys say, our God is able to deliver us, but even if He chooses not to, we're not going to bow. I thought that was so cool. They cranked up the furnace 7 times hotter. The men that was throwing them in, actually, whenever they opened the door and the heat splashed out of them, they even died. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego falls into the flame, and the next morning Nebuchadnezzar goes to look inside, and there's a 4th one walking around. They didn't even smell like smoke. No hair was singed, and God had delivered them. It's a great story. All kinds of biblical principles to follow and to teach and to preach, and continue to do that. But here's the big ticket reason. There's this incredible verse found in Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Listen to what happens. After Nebuchadnezzar sees that God delivered them, Nebuchadnezzar says this, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, say all peoples, to all nations, say nations, and languages, say languages, that dwell in all the earth, say dwell in all the earth. It's a mouthful, right? I'm going to read it together. To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked in me. Now, I'm not saying Nebuchadnezzar had suddenly become a follower of God. As a matter of fact, if I'm going to read this one verse here that's not actually on the PowerPoint, Lindsay, so that I want you to hear what it says in Daniel chapter 3, the latter verses of Daniel chapter 3. It's right before we begin to read in Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar said, okay? So he's not a follower of God. He says, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language that speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made into an ash heap. Never heard of that evangelism strategy before in my life, okay? He's basically saying, if you talk bad about their God, I'm telling you, I'm going to cut you in half and I'm going to burn your house down. So he was not a follower of God. But I'm saying that God even used a wicked king to put his name to all the peoples of the earth. Because I want you to hear it again. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. I thought it good to declare to you the signs and wonders of the Most High God. Listen, it wasn't about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was about God. Do you understand? It wasn't about Moses. It wasn't about David. It wasn't about Joshua. It wasn't about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it's not about you. And it's not about me. Our life does not belong to us. My life is not about me. It's about taking the name of Jesus to every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. That might be right here in Tahlequah. That doesn't mean you got to get on a plane. There's a varsity team and there's a junior varsity team. Every call is equally important and every call is vital. Now here's my problem. It's so easy to get up and scream this stuff. But you just watch next week. You follow me around, you'll see me, you'll catch me. I'll be living again like it's all about me. All about me. Listen, I'm telling you, my life's not about me. And your life is not about you. God is saying, I'm going to get this done with you, without you. Every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. And that is not some kind of statement of saying, I believe God selects some and doesn't select some. I believe Jesus died that none should perish. But I want you to hear, if the Bible says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And the book of Revelation describes it, that at least one person from every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation will be there. It will happen, whether we get with it or whether we just go into this nice little spiritual coma and take his grace for granted. Still go to heaven because grace is grace. I was telling you, if it was on works, I'd still go to hell. So it's not about any of these people. It's always about God. Now, I want to go to one more, another familiar stop. I love this story, Daniel in the lion's den. Great, great story. As a matter of fact, you know, King Darius, and Darius really liked Daniel. He liked him. Had a lot of admiration for him, put him in charge of everything. But there were some men that got really jealous, and these guys came to Darius and said, hey, man, we love you so much, King Darius, because they were blowing smoke. Why don't we make a decree that if anybody seeks any wisdom from anybody other than you, they have to be thrown in the lion's den. Well, that fed his ego, so he signed the decree. Well, those guys knew all along that they would catch Daniel praying because he always did it every day. So sure enough, they caught Daniel praying still to the one true God. They came to Darius and said, hey, you got to do something about this. And Darius didn't even want to, but he knew he'd been trapped because his signature was on the decree. So he throws Daniel into the lion's den. Didn't even sleep that night, the king didn't. The next morning, he runs to the mouth of the lion's den, and he calls out and says, Daniel, did your God deliver you? And he said, King Darius, may you live forever. He said, yes, my God delivered me. So what happened? Took the guys that, that tricked him, threw them into the lion's den. Lions were suddenly hungry, right? So we know the story, and it's a great story. And there's biblical truth after biblical truth and principle after principle that we need to preach and teach and live. But here is the one pinnacle verse that shows why God, first and foremost, allowed the Daniel experience to take place. In Daniel chapter 6, verses 25 and 26, then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, say all peoples, say nations, Say, and languages. Say, and dwell in all the earth. I want to read it again. Then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. Now, nobody can make somebody else tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. The point is, God allowed the whole thing to happen so people would say, not sure about this Daniel guy, but who is his God? The Daniel life took place so that God's name would be made famous. Say, Abraham. All the peoples of the earth, they're all going to be blessed through you, because of you. And then God takes off on this amazing journey. And we find out it's not about Moses, it was about God. It wasn't about Joshua, it was about God. It wasn't about David, it was about God. It wasn't about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it was about God. It wasn't about Daniel, it was about God. And it's not about you, it's about God. And my life is not about me, it's about God. But God is saying, hear me, I love you, and I'm going to get this done regardless, but I am inviting you right now to join me on this radical, passionate, rush-filled journey with high spots and low spots, with victories and failures, with tears of joy and agonizing defeat from time to time because we're human. But I'm inviting you to join me. And it's the only thing on this planet that's worth living for, and even more so worth giving your life for in death. I'm inviting you to join me because I'm going to get it done. Because every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation will be there. Well, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's 400 years of silence. God does not speak intentionally. Several generations lived and died. And they would pass on the stories of a Messiah that was going to come. And I can't imagine the doubt that must have filled those men's heart and those women's heart from time to time after about the third or fourth generation saying, I'm telling you, we keep hearing he's coming. He's coming. He's coming, right? 400 years of silence. And then in Matthew 1:1, God speaks. And I want you to listen to what it says. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of who? Abraham. Promise kept. All the way back to Genesis 12:3, where he says, Abraham, I'm telling you, buddy, all families will be blessed because of you. And here's what God's doing. He's saying, guys, your life has never been about you. Never has been, never will be. Matter of fact, if you want to find true passion in your life, give yours up. Because I'm inviting you to join me on a journey. And I want to show you how little it is about you. And how much it is about making his name famous. Here's my story. Just a piece of it. I'll share the rest of it tomorrow night. I was born in Sullivan, Missouri, little town, raised on a farm south of town there. My mother was 39, my dad was 45. There was plenty of women these days that are having babies in their early 40s, late 30s, but that wasn't customary back then. I was an accident to my mom and dad. I was on purpose for God. No accidents with God, thankfully, right? My mom, I'm the baby of 6. My dad, I'm the baby of 3. My mother had been married once before marrying my dad. And I was raised in church. My mom and dad had both made commitments to Christ about a year before I was born. I was the one baby born, and they said, we don't know why you gave us this kid, but he's yours. And I believe God listens to that. And so at age 6, I walked an aisle of a Southern Baptist church. It was a great church. My main motivation of walking that aisle was about 2 weeks before my sister had walked that aisle, and she'd gotten a lot of attention. And so I was really doing it to get the attention. I don't remember much about that day other than I did get the attention. 2 weeks later, I was baptized, and I do remember that day because it was the only time I ever got to bring my swimming trunks to church, and that was a pretty huge deal for a 6-year-old boy, okay? But in my mind, I joined the club. And I want you to know, religion worked for me whenever I was a kid, and here's what I mean by that. I had some good friends in that church, and we had a good time. We hung out a lot together. We had this guy that would take us to Royal Ambassador Camp, and we'd go on other weekend campouts from time to time. Another farmer there in our area that every time there was a snow day, he'd take us all sledding. We had a good time. But suddenly at age 14, the first thing that happened to me that shook me to my core And that was my mother and father got a divorce. And I remember running back to my religion because I had some questions I really needed the answer to, and my religion fell short. Now, it wasn't the fault of that great church. It certainly was not the fault of that great pastor. It was the fault of what I was missing. But it fell short. I was empty. A couple years later, at about age 16, I had a brother that just got out of the penitentiary. Some of my buddies' older brother was in the pen at the same time, and we started running around together, and I started running around with their older brothers, and I got introduced to some stuff that I embraced pretty hard. Our drug of choice was alcohol, and you can legalize it at a certain age, but I'm telling you, it's as addictive and just as wicked as meth or cocaine or crack heroin or anything else you can put on the list, crack cocaine or heroin. But our main drug of choice was alcohol. And in a short time, I realized that it had a lot better hold on me than I had on it. And I just couldn't walk away. And my life was in a downward spiral. And at age 20, after a few years had flown by, my dad, a second thing happened that shook me to my foundation, and that is I found out my dad, who was my life and was my hero, was diagnosed with cancer. Doc said he had a short time to live. I stood in our little Sullivan Memorial Hospital in the hallway, listening to Dr. Delator, our old World War II doctor that had the gift of bluntness, and we kind of liked that because he told us like it was. I listened from the hallway as our doctor broke the news to my dad. And I'll never forget him saying, I'm going to let you out of here in a couple of days. Go say goodbye to who you want to say goodbye to. It's just that serious. And our shoulders literally brushed, the doctor in mine, as he was leaving my dad's room and I was walking into my dad's room. And I hoped as a 20-year-old guy, some way, somehow I could bring comfort to my dad. But instead, he began to bring comfort to me. And I'll never forget, I remember like it was yesterday, what he said to me. He said, son, I'd be a fool to be afraid. I have Jesus. It just means I finally get to go home. Now, I was thankful that my dad was able to say that, but I'm telling you, in the same breath, it haunted me. Because I watched my dad, he was able to die with peace, and I couldn't even live with peace. But we'd walked the same aisle, we were baptized in the same tank, we were members of the same church. And for the first time, I began to realize that there must be something else, something he had that I didn't have. And I watched over the next 11 months and 4 days as that dreaded disease took him out, and I watched him die with peace. And my life was tore up. Less than a month prior to his death, I was at the end of my rope, completely sober. I just didn't want to live. I was a passenger in a pickup truck driving out of the southwest corner of our little hometown, heading out toward the farm. We got about a quarter mile outside of town, and pickup truck up around 55, 60 miles an hour, and I just opened the door and jumped out. Just wanted to end it. There was a young lady driving the truck, 18 years old. She had no idea what I was getting ready to do, and it had nothing to do with her. She drove back by and saw the situation I was in and panicked. She was so scared. And I don't blame her for this. I should have never put that young girl in that position. She took off. A few days later, the police came to my hospital bed and said, did she leave you? And I made up a story. Nothing could have been further from the truth, but I said she came back by, and I was ticked off, and she feared, and she left, and they said that's good enough for us. But all I can tell you is I still, to this day, an hour and 40 minutes I can't remember. From the time I jumped out of that truck to about an hour and 40 minutes later, my memory's gone. I remember about 10 seconds in that time frame because I woke up on the side of the blacktop. It was drizzling outside. It was December. It wasn't cold enough to freeze, but it was just damp and cold. And I remember laying there on the shoulder of that highway, damp and cold. I didn't know that I was even on the shoulder of the highway. I had a lot of brain damage. And all I could know was I was in the worst pain that I'd ever been in my life up to that point and to present day. And I remember thinking I must be dreaming and wishing I could wake up. That's all I remember, about 10 seconds, and I was out again. But somewhere, how, in that hour and 40 minutes, I don't know if an angel assisted me, literally. I don't know if somebody came and helped me. I don't know if in a stupor by the grace of God I walked toward town. If I would have walked the other way, I would have bled out because there was nothing out there. But I ended up, there was a guy who owned a gas station on the very southwest corner of our town, and he was closing down his shop, and he said whenever he got in his truck and he began to pull out of his parking lot, his headlights kind of splashed across me, and I was just walking in little circles out in the middle of the street. He saw my condition. He took me inside. He called the ambulance. The ambulance came, and all I can tell you is I remember little bits and pieces over the next several hours, but 3 days later I woke up in a hospital bed, and I was in total darkness. Now, the reason why I was in total darkness, I had done a lot of damage to the left side of my face and my left eye. I had 3 skull fractures to the brain. My left hemisphere was swollen and bleeding. I was too unstable to take to a more serious hospital. They had to keep me right there in our little hospital in our hometown. But I thought I was at an all-time low whenever I threw myself out of that truck, but I found a new low in that hospital bed. They had both eyes bandaged shut because of the damage I'd done to my left eye, and I couldn't tell you if it was noon and sunshiny or if it was midnight. But all I could hear was a clock ticking on the wall. It was the loudest clock I've ever heard in my life. And I laid there in darkness for the next 3 days listening to that clock. And all I could think about was what I'd tried to do to myself, what people were saying about somebody that would do that, the shame and embarrassment that I put my mother through who worked in that hospital, the agony and the heartache that I put my dad through, who I was told later came in with his body racked with cancer and so sick and stayed up through the whole night with me the first night I was there to see if I was going to live. It was a brutal time. A couple weeks later, they cut me loose. And less than 2 weeks later, I attended my dad's funeral. He died on a Friday. His funeral was on a Sunday. And back in those days, people didn't work on Sundays like they have to today. Place was packed. Found yet another low when I walked in with those bandages on, and I felt like every eye was on me. I'm sure it wasn't, but I felt that way. In the next 2.5 years, I still just ran. But one of the number one influences on my life was my dad. There were some other guys that came into my life, a guy named Monty Schatz and different ones like that, a guy that had cystic fibrosis and had no reason to have joy in his life, but he had joy in his life, and it puzzled me. Because I watched that guy as I attended his funeral and his brother's funeral 2 years later. And I watched those guys die with peace. And all I can tell you is 2.5 years later, in a really ugly place, in a really ugly time of life, and I'll tell you more about the story tomorrow night, I come to the realization that God had to be more to me than a bunch of facts that were crammed into my head whenever I was a kid. They were facts. But as the saying goes, I was missing heaven by about 18 inches. I had it all right here, but I'd never taken it out of my head and embraced it with my heart. And I'll never forget talking to God, communicating, and coming to this realization. And I'll tell you how I found peace and how I finally found the security of knowing that I was saved tomorrow night. But I knew I had to come to the realization of simply saying this: God, I'm stuck. I'm a sinner. I ought to go to hell, and I can't stop. I'm not justifying it. I'm not excusing it away, but I will never be able to be sinless. I can't even take a baby step toward you. I can't be Baptist enough, Christian enough, non-denominational enough, Catholic enough. I can't. I need to be rescued. And I believe you sent the rescuer. Born of a virgin, walked on this earth for 33 years, 100% God, 100% man. As a 24-year-old guy, those were the two biggest pills for me to swallow. How does a virgin have a baby? And how do you have 100% God, 100% man? But I had to ask two fundamental questions. Number one, do I believe there's a God? And I always have. And number two, can God do anything? Because if God can't do anything, he's not God. So I found out you don't have to throw your brain out the window to become a follower of Jesus Christ. There's more intellectual evidence of that than anything's ever happened on the planet. But there are a couple of components we must accept by faith. And I'll promise you this: if I could figure out God, he wouldn't be much of a God. There's a couple of components we have to say, he's God, I'm not. I believe in the virgin birth. And I believe Jesus walked on this earth, not on a 2-week mission trip, 33 years, and experienced every temptation that I've ever experienced. But he did not sin. But what better way could he prove that he gets me than to become me? He became one of us for 33 years. He knows the heartache, the difficulty, the joys and the sorrows. He knows. And always, like we were tempted, he was tempted. And he died on a cross, and he rose from the dead on the third day. He split the entire world calendaring system, and he did it so our sins could be forgiven. And I just had to simply communicate and say, God, I'm a sinner. I'm stuck. You sent the rescuer, and Jesus, from this moment on, I don't want you just to be the God of my dad, or the God of my pastor, or the God of my church, or the God that my great aunt used to talk about at all the family reunions. And she was real as can be, but I thought she was a loon. And today I know how much I love her because she was real, still is. But from this moment on, Jesus, I want you to be my God. It's you and me one-on-one. And I started that relationship with him. If I would have died on the day that they told me I should have died, right now, I would have been in hell for 33 years, 11 months, and 19 days. It's a running clock in my head. 33 years, 11 months, and 19 days. And even though 33 years and 11 months and 19 days seems like a long time, it would not be the first millisecond of an eternity in hell. Now, how in the world can I stand before you tonight and say my life is about me? It's not about me. And it has never been about me. Next week, I'll find myself living like it is again. But I want to submit to you tonight that your life is not about you. We better get over some stuff in this filthy rich. I'll never forget coming home from Haiti for the first time. Norm, you were there so many times as well, you and Karen. Saying to my mom, we've been filthy rich all our life and we didn't even know it. We've got to get over some stuff. Either we're going to get serious about this whole Jesus thing, or we're going to keep coasting like the Church of North America. And I want to ask you tonight, with a God that says, I will not give up on you and I will not let you go, with a God that says, I'm inviting you to be a part of this journey that will mess you up. I'm going to get it done with you, without you. But I'm inviting you. He's going to get it done with me, without me, but he's invited me to make his name renowned to every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. The William Carey quote from Sunday morning, I believe it was, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. To know the will of God, you need an open Bible and an open map. And your map may say Africa. Your map may say Iraq. Your map may say Tahlequah, Fort Gibson. Just as important. Just as important. But will we join God? Because it's not about us.